Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we begin discussing the American Revolution. So two things to keep in mind here. One, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence are not the same thing. And two, while I know this will upset some of you, the American Revolution was not really about taxes. Mr. Green, it was about tea, right? Also, it was not about tea. The Boston Tea Party was about taxes and our God-given right to smuggle. It's a little confusing me from the past, but that's why Crash Course is here. So as you'll recall, the 7 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which made the colonists cranky because it limited their ability to take land from the Indians, and it also left them holding the bag for a lot of war debt. Wars, as you may have noticed, are expensive, and the British government had to borrow £150 million, and the interest payments on that money ate up half of the national budget. So in order to pay for the war, the British decided to raise taxes. And since the primary beneficiaries of the war had been the American colonists, the British government felt it was only fair if some of the burden fell to them. Now, taxes on colonial trade were nothing new. The British government had placed taxes on a bunch of items in order to reduce competition with Britain, including wool and hats and molasses. Right, of course. But those taxes were about trying to regulate trade in a mercantilist way more than trying to pay back war debt, and also they were easy to avoid via smuggling, which we did because this is America. But mostly the colonists were angry because they didn't have any say about the new taxes that Britain was imposing. I mean, after all, by 1760, some colonies had been setting their own taxes through their own legislatures for 100 years. So the taxes themselves weren't really the problem. It was their lack of parliamentary representation. The first purportedly oppressive tax, the Sugar Act of 1764, extended the Molasses Act by changing the tax on imports from the Caribbean from 6 cents per gallon all the way up to 3 cents per gallon. So they actually cut the tax, but they decided to start enforcing it by stamping out smuggling. And to that end, the act also gave British courts the right to try colonial smugglers, taking that power away from colonial courts, which had been notoriously lenient when it came to smuggling on account of how they enjoyed smuggled rum as much as the next guy. But those initial acts weren't nearly as annoying as the Stamp Act, passed in 1765. The Stamp Act declared that all printed material had to carry a stamp. Unsurprisingly, that stamp was not free. This was purely to gain revenue for Britain, and it mostly affected people who used a lot of paper, you know, like newspaper printers and lawyers, just the kind of people you want to anger about taxes. So in October, protesters organized the Stamp Act Congress, which after a meeting decided to boycott British goods. And this was the first major coordinated action by all the colonies together, and it might be the first time that we can speak of the colonies acting in a united way, almost like, say, a government. Committees of correspondence, which had been created to encourage opposition to earlier acts, now grew to coordinate the boycott efforts, and they helped people become more aware of their liberties, and they also spurred street actions that occasionally became violent. These direct actions were organized by groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and guess what? Coordinated action worked. The British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but they did pass the Declaratory Act, which was all like, listen, you're not the boss of us. We can tax you. We don't want to tax you right now as it happens, but we could if we wanted to, but we won't, but we could. So the repeal of the Stamp Act was seen by many in the colonies as a huge victory, but most of the people organizing the protests were elites, you know, the kind of people who use paper. But once you start talking about the idea of representation, everybody wants in. Meanwhile, Great Britain still needed money, so Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend got Parliament to pass new taxes in 1767. The so-called Townshend Acts also created a new Board of Customs to stop smuggling, which we didn't like one bit. You don't like it when I say we? Well, tough luck. I'm an American. Bring back the Libertage, Stan! Many colonists again responded with a boycott, and women got in on the act this time, with the Daughters of Liberty encouraging homespun clothes to replace British ones. But not all the states were on board. Like, artisans loved the boycotts because they got more money. But merchants from cities like Philadelphia and New York weren't so happy because they made their livings by importing and selling the very goods that were now being boycotted. On occasion, protests did get out of hand, as